The early Middle Ages in Britain began when William of Normandy was proclaimed king in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day in 1066 year. The assumption of William of Normandy, also known as William the Conqueror, was in the middle of a chaos and confusion between French and English society. But after years, Williams were gaining confidence, and little by little Normans were establishing its domination, even when there were no more than 10,000 Normans living in the middle of the hostile population of 1 or 2 million of Englishmen. To establish domination, they had to build castles, strong points from which a human could dominate the population. The preeminence of France was deep in the fields of music, literature, and architecture. A well-educated Englishman was trilingual. English was his mother tongue. He also would have some knowledge of Latin, and he would speak fluent French. Churches in England were adapted by the architects and artists with elements from the Mediterranean world, especially from France. In fact, one of the most important influences left by Normans in England was the Gothic style in the buildings. The characteristic of Gothic style are those pointed arcs, ribbed vaulting, rose windows, and flying buttresses. The main example of this is Westminster Cathedral, the icon of London and England. The Abbey has the highest Gothic vault in England, and it was made to seem higher by making the aisles narrow. The design is based on a system of geometrical proportion, but its English features include single rather than double aisles and a long nave with wide projecting transepts. Today is still church dedicated to regular worship and to the celebration of great events in the life of the nation. Neither a cathedral nor a parish church, Westminster Abbey is a royal peculiar under the jurisdiction of a dean and a captor, subject only to the sovereign. It's a place for the coronation and burial of monarchs. Many famous people also were buried there, like Lady Di or Stephen Hopkins, for example. History of Westminster Abbey. Started in the 1040s, King Edward, later known as Saint Edward the Confessor, established his royal palace by the bank of the river Thames on the Thorny Island. Close by was a small Benedictine monastery. This monastery Edward chose to build a large stone church in honor of Saint Peter the Apostle. This church became known as the Westminster, to distinguish it from St. Paul's Cathedral that was located in the Eastminster, in the city of London. Unfortunately, when the new church was consecrated in 1065, the king died and was entombed in front of the high altar. The only traces of Edward's monastery to be seen today are in the round arcs and massive supporting columns of the undercroft and the fixed chamber in the cloisters. Edward's Abbey survived for 2 centuries until the middle of the 13th century, when King Henry III decided to rebuild it in the new Gothic styles of architecture. 2 centuries later, a further addition was made to the abbey when the western towers, as we can see today. Canterbury Cathedral is another example. The cathedral's history began in 597 AD when Augustine, a monk sent by Pope Gregory the Great, arrived as a missionary and established in Canterbury. Stand on the exact spot in 1170, Archbishop Thomas Becket was murdered in the cathedral, making the site one of Europe's most important pilgrimage centers, as told most famously in Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. The cathedral houses a Romanesque crypt dating back to the 11th century, 12th century early Gothic choir, and 14th century perpendicular nave.
In this period, there were great changes in the social and cultural process, and a tremendous proliferation of written records, which occurred during the 12th and 13th centuries. One of them was the Anglo-Saxon document. Whereas in the reign of Edward the Confessor, only the king had a seal. In Henry III reign, we can measure the most of sealing which Chancery used. In 1199, the Chancery clerk began to keep copies on rolls of parchment of most of the letters sent out under the Great Seal. By the 12th century, there were some schools of higher learning in English, and by the 1220s, two universities. First, the Oxford. There where men could learn several practical subjects such as administration and elementary legal procedure, and the other university was Cambridge. On the basis of this document, historians have decided that they were characteristic of the later Middle Age, the period of bastard feudalism. William I, from 1071 to the end of his reign, most of William's attention was taken up by war and diplomacy on the continent. William's neighbors were alarmed by his new power and took every opportunity to diminish it. At their head were King Philip of France. William related, and while his troops sacked Mainz, he received the injury from which he died. On 9th of September, William died. His body was carried to his great church of St. Stephen at Caen.
Religion in the Middle Ages was dominated by Christianity. It is the era in which the great cathedrals of Europe were built, and the Catholic Church was only church in Europe. The love of the land and leading role in the government were all in the hands of the leading church leaders like bishop and archbishop. It was an era when the vested power in the hands of the Pope were so great that he could even excommunicate a king for a misdeed. From birth to death, the life of the medieval people was dominated entirely by the church, gained power and wealth. Large cathedrals were built when the traditional Roman-style church became insufficient for accommodating their increasing population by the 12th century. The monks and nuns in the Christian monastery had to live by rules set by Saint Benedict and were known as Benedictines. They were forbidden the right to their own property, to leave the monastery, or get involved in worldly concern and desire. They had to perform many labor and follow the stringent regulations of the church. Monks and nuns on this era were generally well educated. They devoted their entire life to learning and writing. Various scriptures, history, and science in the era were written by monks. The Roman Catholic Church was the supreme power during the Middle Ages. It was stabilizing for in everyday life which keep the community from work together. The love and rule of the land and governance and the people were all affected by religion during the Middle Ages.
Edward the Confessor had to hold that Winchester with a chamber where his treasure was stored, and he had to hold a chamber at Westminster where he had begun to build the abbey. The new castles within his reign were raising in every country and provided lodgings for the king. But most of these new castles were still in the making in his early years and building houses within the valley. The absence of glass for windows means that no house or hall can ever have been properly lighted or very warm, for windows were as small as possible and the wooden shutter protected the inhabitant from the worst weather cannot have eliminated drafts. Floor softened with a carpet of rushes. Some of the most important English castles lay adjacent to or within royal forests. Windsor, Northampton, Nottingham, and Marlborough are a few examples. Windsor and at Winchester, Henry II had the walls of his chamber decorated with painting. Henry I maintained a part of wild beasts of Woodstock. Henry II built a palace at Clarendon decorated with marble columns. All through this period, castles were becoming more elaborate and more expensive. The moat and bailey of the Conqueror reigned developed into the stone castle of the next generation. It seems probable that the outer walls along the band which protected the bailey were built before the moat itself was fortified with stonework. In the early Middle Age social, man was content with a single room with a fire on the hearth. The lord and his family ate there with the servants. It was a hall like a church or an old barn. The first room to be added was the chamber for the lord and his wife, a room to the sons and another for the daughters of the house was also necessary. The kitchen was a separated building at the beginning of this period, and it was not until late in the 13th century that chimneys became common in the ordinary house.
In the 13th century, Henry III was using glass for the windows of his palace, but the most striking development in house building that took place in this period was the appearance of the chimney. By the later part of the 13th century, minor houses were being built with the material reduced to hand, with local and personal variations. Stokesay Castle in Shropshire is a larger version of the hall and chamber type. Two windows in the principal chamber look into the hall, which has an open timber roof. Stokesay Castle was built by a rich cloth merchant of Ludlow. In the years between the coming of Normans and the death of Edward I, builders and architects were applying all their ingenuity and raising great cathedrals. Also, they elaborated ordinary houses. The austerity of the 12th century house meant that men and women alike wore ample and warm garments. Contemporary drawings show men of position from the king downwards dressed in long full cloaks reaching to the feet, sometimes having sleeves too. At the end of the century, women were wearing tight sleeves with long hangings from the wrists. King John habitually
wore a string of precious stones about his neck, and men as well as women wore jeweled brooches. Standard of comfort in the ordinary house meant that rigors of travel were hardly felt. In places where the king and his court habitually stayed, the great men had their accustomed lodgings, to which they sent their servant on ahead to prepare for their coming. When Richard I was moving down to Northampton to Southampton Road with a large company, he spent the first night at his hunting lodge at Silverstone. When the bishop arrived at Brackley, he went into his lodging and ordered the tables to be laid for himself. When the King of Scots came late from hunting, and all this was told him, he was angry, refused to eat the food his servant had prepared, and went back to complain to Richard I at Silverstone. The king and his court frequented most the forest to country, but that covered a very wide area. This shire court met every 4 or 5 weeks, and the court of each hundred or wapentake met at similar intervals, fixed by custom but varying from court to court. The course of justice was slow, and litigants often found that they must make many journeys before their cases were concluded.
From early times, English kings had been interested to protect those who used the roads along which royal authority ran. 4 roads in particular, Watling Street, the Fosse Way, the Icknield Way, and Ermine Street, were in the special peace of the king, so that those who committed crimes on them were at his mercy. This conception of the king's peace running on a high road had spread by the 12th century to cover all the land, but high roads still retained some special flavor of majesty. They were royal ways. Custom had laid it down that the highway should be so wide that 2 loaded carts could pass each other, that 2 rustics standing one on each side of the way could make their gods meet, that 16 knights fully armed could ride abreast. Encroachment on the king's highway must be reported to his judges when they visited their shire, so that the land thus taken could be restored to the road. The transport of heavy goods which could not be split up into packs was done in carts, sometimes described as long carts. They moved slowly, particularly in winter. It took 9 days in the winter of 1294 for 21 cart loads of treasure to be taken from London to Norwich for shipment overseas. All ranks of society could be met on the roads of medieval England. The king and his court frequented most the forest country, but that covered a very wide area. Magnates and barons of less exalted rank alike had estated in widely separated shares and moved their households from one to another as a matter of course. Those who were strong enough invariably traveled on horseback. They could easily cover the ground at an average of 30 miles a day. An urgent business and with relays of horses a considerably higher average might be reached. The ordinary business of share and 100 carts produced a considerable volume of local traffic. The share court met every 4 or 5 weeks, and the court of each 100 or wapentake met a similar intervals fixed by custom, but varying from court to court. Each meeting brought together people of local position within the jurisdiction of the court. The course of justice was slow, and litigants often found that they must make many journeys before their cases were concluded.
The old London Bridge of nursery rhyme fame dates from 1176, when Peter, a priest and chaplain of St. Mary's of Church, began construction of the foundation. In 1202, on the advice of the Archbishop of Canterbury, King John entreated and admonished Arch Isenberg, the master of the schools of saints, to come to London to build the stone bridge. In the Bodleian Library at Oxford, a map drawn in the early 14th century as a guide to those who use English roads. The first great modern description of English roads, made and published in 1675 in the Britannia of John Ogilvy. Each map is accompanied by a double list of distance, measured miles, and what Ogilvy calls compute miles. The map made in the 14th century helps to explain the curious fact that Oxford became the first English university. Between 1016 and 1116, Oxford was repeatedly the meeting place of important assemblies. Cambridge is a town at a river crossing, but in the 11th century it was little more than a local market town, the county town of a small shire, whereas Oxford was one of the chief towns in England. It is very easy to underestimate the amount of education that was being provided in the early Middle Ages. If men of position were illiterate, it was because they had made no effort to learn, rather than that provision for their teaching was not available. A boy who became one of the best chroniclers of the 12th century under the name Ordicus Vital was sent when 5 years old to a school in Shrewsbury. There he learned reading, grammar, and chants.
In this period, as throughout and beyond the Middle Ages, the right of licensing school and teacher belongs to the bishop of the diocese. William Fitz said that the three principal churches of the city, the churches of St. Paul, Holy Trinity, and St. Martin, have famous schools by privilege and virtue of the ancient dignity. Also, Latin was the common language by learning in that time. By the death of Henry II, the ability to express the legal transactions in clear and grammatical Latin was possessed by hundreds of individual parts of the land. The schooling parts were the most famous, but already before 1,150 number of learned men were living and teaching there. The rapid increase in the number of students in the year after 1840 flourishing community of scholars.
Despite the position of dignity and influence, it was difficult to overstress the rudimentary character of university organization in this age. In 1231, the king made his strong directions to the sheriff about university discipline that the universities themselves began the attempt to supervise students. But these directions failed to achieve their end. In the 13th century, the university authorities did not show themselves very competent in the management either of their young students or of their financial affairs. In 1249, William of Durham bequeathed to the University of Oxford. The first Oxford College was founded in stages between 1264 and 1274 by Walter of Meran, Chancellor under both Henry III and his son. Adolphe the Master, supported by William of Durham's bequests, were converted into University College. Undergraduates lived in halls or in rooms. A hall was simply a house occupied exclusively by students under the charge of a principal. He was generally a graduate. He made his profit from letting the rooms and from teaching. The university had no property in the halls, but it had been established that once the house was let as a hall for students, it could not be converted to a private residence unless the owner wished to live in it himself, so long as someone desired to rent it as an academic hall. Between 1066 and 1307, the Normans immediately preceding the conquest were in the forefront of cathedral and parish churches. It was not until the lifetime of the conqueror himself, and very little before the invasion of England, that Norman builders succeeded in covering the main span of the church with a stone vault. The work of English builders of the age before the conquest can be judged only from such parish churches as escaped destruction in the period of church building, which began after William I's rule was secured in 1070. Canterbury Cathedral itself was partially destroyed by fire in 1067, and Archbishop Lanfranc began to build its successor soon after he was consecrated in 1017. The outstanding Anglo-Norman church is the Cathedral at Durham, begun by Bishop William in 1093. Its builder had 20 years' experience in England to draw on, and both in plan and in decoration it outstripped anything attempted at an earlier date. Within 70 years of the conquest, with the building of a great cathedral having a complete system of rivet vaulting, the Norman architects in England had surpassed the achievements of their European contemporaries.
Most of the architecture from the period of Henry I it has not survived. Like Worcester in 1175, the central tower of the first Norman church at Winchester fell in 1107. Norwich Cathedral in Norfolk, begun by Bishop Herbert Losinga in 1096 and remains today. Rochester Cathedral is England's second oldest, having been founded in AD 604 by Bishop Justus. The present building dates back to the work of the French monk Gundulf in 1080. The glorious Norman architecture of the nave, parts of the crypt, and well as one of the finest Romanesque facades in England, make this an inspirational place to visit. The cathedral is blessed with some fine examples of later Gothic styles, as well as the magnificent 4th century chapter library door. Ely Cathedral preserves the greater part of a Norman church of the first class. The nave of Southwell is the best work of the early 12th century. It has none of the ostentation of the carved pillars and vaulted roof of Durham, but its solid majesty gives the impression of unshakable strength. St. Hugh's new choir at Lincoln was purely Gothic.
Henry I applied himself to uniting the Norman and his English subjects into a single nation. In 1106, the king recovered Normandy from his elder brother, whom he defeated at Canterbury with an army composed partly at least of Englishmen. William of Malmesbury and Ordericus Vitalis were early members of a succession of Latin historian thought. These historians differed markedly from another in education, experience, and natural ability, and their opportunities of acquiring information were by no means equal. The Song of Dermot told a true story, but inevitable tended to exaggerate the importance of his hero. Stories about real people who for some reason had fallen into trouble with the king or the law were always popular. During the 13th century, French remained the language of the court and of aristocratic circles. Poems and stories were being written in French throughout this period. Latin was the language in which official records were kept. It was the language of the law and of the judicial records. But in the later half of the century, French was gaining ground at the expense of Latin, some clerks and judges.